Welcome. So we're going to go ahead and get started. If you need the interpreters, ASL interpreters should be spotlighted for you so that you can see them on your screen. If you need captioning, I'm going to drop this in the chat and you'll be able to see, pull up the captioning in a different window. Or if you want to access it on here, if you go to the three little dots at the bottom under More, you could pull up View Live Transcript there as well. So we're going to go ahead and get started. My name is Alina Santillan. My pronouns are he, him, and I am the Director of Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism. And this is a lunch and learn that I want to give 100% the credit to the young people who came up with this idea, who helped find panelists, and who are really directing how we're going to do this today. So one of our panelists is Ipena, and another young person who's here today named Anya. Anya Shukla created this panel and are driving this work. So I just want to uplift those young people who are leading the way in this panel. So again, my name's Alina Santillan. I have short, dark black hair. I have light olive skin, and I'm wearing olive green button up with a little gold chain. I'm at my parents' house in Louisiana, and I'm behind a blurred background. And I'm going to give a land acknowledgement, and then I'm going to ask the panelists to introduce themselves. So we always start our lunch and learns with an Indigenous Native land acknowledgement. So I want to acknowledge that we live, work, and play on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish peoples, and that we occupy this land. This acknowledgement does not take the place of authentic relationships with Indigenous communities, but serves as a first step in honoring the land that we are on. And there's actually going to be at Alki Beach at 7:30 Thursday, which is tomorrow, July 1st, 6 p.m. is the arrival time. The vigil's at 7:30, and it'll be a prayerful gathering for us to embrace and love and offer prayers for all the little ones that didn't make it home and for the children of every survivor. These in particular, the past couple of weeks have been incredibly painful for the Native and Indigenous communities who are being re-traumatized in every sense. As residential schools that used to be there, they're uncovering mass graves and burial sites. And we just want to make sure that we remember and honor and take accountability for our history and the trauma that has been experienced from those communities. So tomorrow, Thursday, July 1st, 6 p.m., the vigil's at 7:30. It's at Alki, ALKI Beach in Seattle. And they're asking people to wear orange regalia or ribbon skirt and other regalia that would honor those young people. So thank you for holding space and for honoring those communities. I'm going to ask everybody to introduce themselves. So Hannah, I'm going to start with you if that's okay.
Thank you so much for having me. My name is Hannah Wilson. I use she and they pronouns. And I guess I have blonde hair right now, and I'm wearing a striped shirt and a silver chain. Raised. I'm black and white, and I'm in my bedroom right now in Seattle. And currently, I am the farm manager at Yes Farm, which is an urban farm initiative of the Black Farmers Collective here in Seattle. So a lot of my work is centered around community building, education, and distributing food to communities of color and uplifting Black leadership. And then on the side, I also am the co-chair on both the Seattle Disability Commission of the City of Seattle, and I also am a co-chair on the Environmental Justice Committee with the Office of Sustainability and the Environment. So with all of that work, I'm really trying to do grassroots work and also look at how we can change policies to talk about disability justice and also talk about food and climate resilience and how all of that intersects. So thank you for having me today.
Thanks for that introduction, Hannah. Julian, I want you to introduce yourself next.
Hi, my name is Julian Robinson, and I have short black hair and wearing glasses, dark skin, and I have a pink hoodie on. And I am in my bedroom, and I attend the Washington School for the Deaf. Thank you for inviting me.
So wonderful to have you here, Julian. And Izzy, last but not least.
Hi, I'm Izzy. I use she, her pronouns. I am an accessibility advisor at the Colorization Collective. I helped organize this panel. I'm so excited that this is finally happening. This has kind of been an idea that's been bouncing in my brain for a bit, so I'm really happy you guys made it and can help make this a possibility. I have dark hair, bangs, I'm in my bedroom, there's records on the wall, posters on the other, I have a beige shirt on, I have some green eyeshadow. Yeah.
Thanks, Izzy. Thanks for taking time to introduce yourselves. So I wanted to go ahead and jump in, and we can do round robin, however it feels best to address some of these questions. But really this panel is to talk about disability, accessibility, and the intersections as folks of color around what does that look like? What are the complexities that come with that? So kind of one of the first questions that I wanted to ask is, do you prefer identity first, so disabled person language, or person first language, a person who is disabled? And then depending on which one you address yourself as, why? Izzy, do you want to kick us off?
I personally prefer disability first language. I know a lot of people who kind of started the whole, I want to be addressed as a person first, which is totally valid. It was kind of coming from this place of needing to remind people that you're a human being before you're a disability, because people tend to kind of write you off as kind of not really being there, and it's very dehumanizing when you're a disabled person. But for me, I don't know, it feels more dehumanizing to need to remind people that I'm a person before I remind them that I'm disabled. So that's why I prefer disability first language.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Julian, how about you?
Actually, yeah, I would say I'd prefer, I wouldn't say necessarily disability, but I say I'm deaf. And I'm proud of being deaf. And so, yeah, I would be called a deaf person. And yeah, that would be my identity. So I would say deaf first as opposed to person language first.
What about for you, Hannah?
Yeah, similar to the other panelists, I do use identity first language. And I also will say that I'm deaf, largely because like being disabled and deaf is like how I move through the world, and it has a profound impact on like how I enter spaces, and also the spaces that I want to create for like disabled folks and for deaf folks. And I think also growing up, you know, I wouldn't say that I was disabled, or I wouldn't say that I was deaf, because I was largely able to sort of have an invisible disability in many ways, like with long hair and like covering my ears. And that was sort of based in shame. And so I'm definitely like working on doing that and like just talking about it, because it has a huge impact on how I walk through the world and how people interact with me. So yeah, that's why I use identity first language.
Thank you for all of your vulnerability and sharing that. I think it kind of leads me to this kind of next piece and talking about, you know, how you move about the world, how the world interacts with you, how you interact back. What is a common misconception about your disability? Hannah, you want to start?
Yeah. Yeah, I think like this question is like a really good one to ask because people often assume that because I can talk well through certain spaces, that I don't necessarily need any accommodations. When really it's that I'm very exhausted at the end of the day after doing all of the emotional and like mental work that I do. Um, and like I'm always listening very hard and like trying to adjust able-bodied and like hearing spaces. And so it requires all this energy because the world isn't accessible and like isn't centering disability justice. And so and like even more so for folks with like a more visible disability, a more physical disability, like we need to make sure that those accommodations are there. So I think like a misconception is just that like a hearing aid will fix it all and that I don't struggle with my disability. There's, you know, a variety of environments that I struggle in and like a few that I thrive in. And I often have to like set my own boundaries and like make time to rest and take care of myself um, more than able-bodied folks. And so that's my misconception.
Thanks, Hannah. Julian, what about for you?
Well, one of the major misconceptions, I would say, I'll give an example. You'll hear something like, oh, deaf people can't drive, or can deaf people read? You know, a lot of can't, you know, and maybe a deaf person can't speak typically like a hearing person, but there are lots of deaf people who do. And so, and we can do anything except hear, ultimately.
Yeah, what are the limitations that the culture outside of the deaf community puts on folks who hear differently or folks who identify as deaf or are hard of hearing? I think a lot of times people who are hearing end up putting limitations on people that don't exist, for sure. Izzy, what about for you?
I'm autistic, so a lot of people, when they hear that, think that there's like just like this kind of high and low functioning to it. Like it's linear. It's not linear. It's autism spectrum disorder. It's more of like an XYZ graph, you know. And just this idea that like if you're able to like make eye contact or verbally communicate, that means like you're high functioning, you don't really struggle with anything, or you're not really autistic, which is very bothersome because I'm someone who can be very neurotypical passing. So I am usually able to maintain eye contact with people. I'm able to verbally communicate. I'm not a nonverbal autistic, and there is a lot of privilege in that, but it doesn't take away from the whole struggle of it. That's why I got the diagnosis. If I was able to just be normal, then I wouldn't have received a diagnosis of being autistic. I don't know the exact quote, but I heard somebody say a while back that like the term high functioning is used to invalidate an individual's experience with autism, and then the term low functioning is used to invalidate an individual's experience as a human being. And I feel like that really resonates because you also see a lot of people referring to like nonverbal autistics as low functioning and kind of writing them off as not really being there. And a lot of nonverbal people are perfectly able to understand the world around them. You know, it just because you're not able to talk or kind of understand the workings of the world doesn't mean you're not intelligent and communicative. You just need to give people ways to cope with that. You know, I think for me is I didn't understand a lot of like social stuff, especially as a kid. I didn't really understand how to express emotion. As a child, that was something that had to be taught to me, like how to inflect my voice for certain things. But that didn't mean that I didn't feel, you know? So just kind of that, just because you have issues with things doesn't mean that it's not a linear thing.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Izzy. I think sometimes we don't think about not whether other folks are a good fit for our culture, but how is maybe our culture not a good fit for everyone else? Like, how are we focused on creating cultures that are truly inclusive? And that would be things like folks who are deaf or hard of hearing don't have to reach out for accessibility. We just automatically provide it. Like, it is something that just comes with our events or our shows. Common misconceptions about, well, you must not like going to see music or things with lights or whatever because you can't see or you can't hear, or maybe there are different limitations that people have, rather than like not having those misconceptions and just providing accessible spaces. For sure. What is something you wish more people would understand about your disability? Julian, do you want to kick us off there?
I'm thinking about how people look at us as deaf people, and they oftentimes call us mute. And they associate that with being dumb or uneducated. So, you know, like I mentioned before, deaf people and hard of hearing people, we can do everything except maybe we can't hear, right? So again, that kind of goes back to the misconceptions.
Yeah, what about for you, Hannah?
Yeah, I think similarly, definitely as a kid, and I see it sometimes now as a young adult too. It's just that people would assume that, I need them to like yell at me or like dumb down, what they're saying in order for me to understand. When really it's just, slowing down a little bit, enunciating a little bit more, and not mumbling. Um, and so like having to ask for that and like make sure that people aren't like my like intellectual disability or like ability to connect with people and like be emotionally vulnerable as like not possible because of my deafness. And I think too, like people kind of forget that like, hearing is a huge part of our like culture and the way that we communicate as people. And so like it can be super isolating to not be part of that and not acknowledge that there are ways for deaf people to participate in all of that if it's accessible. And so yeah, those are some of the things I wish folks like understood more. And I think another thing that I think about a lot is just like how there's sort of a divide a little bit between like the deaf community and like hard of hearing folks and like folks who wear devices. And I'm someone who was able to like get devices and get speech therapy to learn how to talk and all of that. And I see that as like a result of like capitalism and like ableism, as like me having to perform to this like ableist expectation. That has like, while it has provided me many privileges and opportunities, I guess in an able-bodied world, it's like it didn't allow me to just be me. It forced me to sort of be fixed all the time as a kid. It just felt like people were trying to make sure that I could perform and like acknowledge or like fix any weaknesses that I had because of my deafness. And like you said, Alina, just like instead of like figuring out how the culture isn't like inclusive and inviting of disabled people and deaf people, and that the perspectives and knowledges that we have are really important to how we can create like care networks and like how we can take care of each other better. Because everyone benefits from disability justice. So yeah, that's me.
Yeah, well said. Absolutely. Izzy, what about you? I know you shared a little bit in the last question, but what are something you wish people understood more about your disability?
I wish people understood, especially with like the autism thing. I have autism and ADHD, so it's kind of like a double whammy on everything. But I really wish people understood that me verbally communicating and being perceived as normal is, the term is masking. So kind of matching how everyone else is talking, constantly being aware of everyone else's body language, the kind of tone of voice that everyone's using, how everyone else is presenting themselves, and then matching that. It's very tiring, and especially like suppressing stims in public, because I don't exactly want to get stared at in public if I'm excited and my hands kind of flap or whatever, or if I'm using fit toys in public. It's very exhausting and mentally tiring. Even just talking some days, it can be very uncomfortable. I'm not nonverbal. I've never gone nonverbal, but talking just, it's not painful, but it's just uncomfortable some days, especially if I'm overwhelmed, even going out into public, and if there's loud music or
I can't hear nothing.
Oh, I lost your sound, Izzy. Izzy, oh, there you go. You broke up for a minute. I couldn't hear your microphone. There you go.
Where did I leave off at?
If there's loud music. Oh,
yeah. Okay. So if there's loud music, it can be very overwhelming. A lot of people talking at once, people talking at me. It can, because I can't really understand it sometimes. And before Mass, I didn't realize how much I relied on like kind of reading lips. But it's a thing, and now everyone has masks on, and it's a lot harder, especially with people's voices being muffled and not being able to see facial expressions of people. It's really hard to understand what they mean, and just a lot of cues that I had learned to pick up on beforehand it's no longer available. And I use captions when I'm watching videos or TVs, but there's no captions in real life. So it makes it very hard to keep up with conversations while also trying to maintain this front of normalcy. And I'm very lucky that I have very, very good friends who don't care, who are aware of my disabilities and the way that they affect my life. I have a lot of friends who are also autistic. We have fun. But just being in public with people I don't know, especially in school. I'm not in any special education programs. A lot of my teachers like to give verbal directions and only verbal directions, which is horrible. So if they don't have a printout for stuff, I end up missing out on a lot. Due dates, very specific little niche things that can affect my grade. I don't think a lot of people really get that when they think of autistic or ADHD. It's not just kind of bouncing or, the more physical things that people usually associate with that.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that's really enlightening for a lot of folks. Again, going back to misconceptions we have, rather than just centering people's voices instead of making decisions for them or making assumptions for them. What are some some accommodations that are especially beneficial to you, and how do they work? Julian, do you want to take this one first?
Right. So there are many different accommodations that I use. For example, pen and paper to communicate. So oftentimes with someone, I may write notes back and forth. I use the phone sometimes, but in the form of text message communication, right? I use closed captions as well. Like it was mentioned, watching a movie or a TV show, closed captions are really important and beneficial to me. And, for example, in the way of having interpreters like we have here today for communication access. So my hearing family, they know sign language, and so I communicate with them in that way. I go to a school for the deaf, so that really helps me with being in community with people. So I have a laundry list of beneficial accommodations.
That's awesome, Julian. Hannah, how about for you?
Yeah, I think, Izzy sort of touched on this too. It's just like having like captions for events, so I can like keep up with the conversation even here, and having as many visual aids as possible when it comes to like a learning environment or like an event where we're trying to like learn something. I want to make sure that I like actually make sure that I see all the information, because I know that I will probably miss some verbal information. And then that way, I can ask questions if I did miss it verbally, or like all of that. And I think also in like social environments, making sure that folks are speaking clearly, enunciating, slowing down if possible, just talking one at a time, like not trying to talk over one another and like yell. And oftentimes like in, really noisy environments, like having like background noise, like music or like the road or whatever it may be, like a restaurant where there's lots of people talking, it's just going to be like really difficult for me to participate in a conversation with like more than two people at once, with all of that background noise. And I think also something I think about a lot is just like how in like learning environments or like social situations, like having breaks or so for like a long event, like making sure that you have breaks so that folks can like take a break from listening and like, get what they need, get a glass of water, whatever it is. And then also like in classes and stuff, working in small groups so that I can like communicate with fewer people at a time, make sure I didn't miss any information with the large group, and ask questions, and all of that is always helpful. And like, I think at work, when I'm working at the farm, I just really ask folks to speak up and like make sure that they say my name and get my attention before they start talking about something or like asking me something, is really key. It's just making sure that you have my attention. Yeah, those are some of the accommodations that I often ask for from like friends and family and like bigger events too.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that. Izzy, what do you want to add to that? What are some accommodations that that are beneficial to you?
For me, it really helps when people are very clear and communicative about kind of just like everything they're doing. A big part of like being autistic for a lot of people is physical touch. It's not necessarily like a no-go, never do it. If you're with somebody that's autistic, never hug them, never whatever, because I very much love to be hugged and all that. But if somebody's coming from behind me or they're not letting me know what they're doing, it's very uncomfortable. I will flinch very badly. It's not anything like I think a lot of people think it's trauma related. It's not for me. It's just uncomfortable. with being autistic, and just kind of a lot of senses are almost heightened, I guess. I don't know if I'm cutting out because my screen froze, but
You're okay. Your screen was frozen, but we could still hear you.
awesome. So a lot of that with like the noise, if it's very loud, you know, it's not good if strangers are like grabbing my shoulder or whatever. That's not okay for me. Just stuff like that, and people being very clear about tone. Please, if you've never heard of tone tags, it's just like a little thing you can add to the end of sentences. It's like /pause for positive, /gen for genuine. And I have a group chat with my friend who's autistic and my friend who's ADHD, who has a lot of issues with social stuff. And we use tone tags for pretty much every single message we use. It's like the safest place in my life, and it's very great. So people kind of using this passive aggression with me of like, oh, I really wish someone would do this, or oh, I think my sister does this a lot. She's like, oh, I finished the dishes, and then I'll be like, okay, cool. And when I'm supposed to put away the dishes, but nobody told me this. And then it's like, I thought you were gonna put them away. And it's like, you didn't tell me to. So it's just people being very clear about their intentions and what they're expecting from me, or what's gonna happen next. I have a lot of issues with transitions. I feel like that's a lesser known thing with autism, of like, okay, we're gonna do this, and then if you try to quickly steer me away to something else, that doesn't really work in my brain. It's very overwhelming. So if you can give me like a couple minutes in advance of being like, okay, we're gonna go do this thing, and then a couple minutes later, we're gonna do this thing. I plan my days out with like very specific time blocks, so everything can be very consistent and known. So if we can make everything known, yeah, that would be helpful.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think that that's really enlightening for folks that, again, maybe you don't know what other people, we don't know what people are dealing with and what they're going through if they're not open about that. And so really giving us an opportunity today to think about, yeah, how are we creating an inclusive culture without people having to like ask for that, but we're just being proactive and providing that, right? I kind of want to talk about the intersection of like your racial identity and how that intersects with your identity as a disabled person. You know, a lot of Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism, we lead a lot of our equity work, all of our equity work, through the lens of race, because that's something that is the first thing we notice about each other, that intersects with other identities that we're carrying, whether that is a disability, gender, class, and it impacts the way that we move about the world and how people interact with us. So I'm curious if you can kind of talk about, you know, how does your racial identity intersect and impact your identity as a disabled person? Hannah, you want to go first?
Sure. Yeah. You know, the first thing I was thinking about is just like the way that I move through institutions can be very difficult at times because of both my disability and racial identity. You know, I remember in school being like one of the few like kids of color in the classroom, you know, usually the only Black person in the room. And then added to that was being disabled. And I think that I just felt very invisible and that my needs weren't being met on multiple levels, whether it was like being isolated from my peers, not seeing myself in my peers, not seeing myself in the people who were like teaching me in the front of the classroom. And then also just like the way that people like treated me, you know, I think I wasn't as aware of the racism as a child, but very much now when I go to the doctor's office or, you know, when I was in college, like I just can see that people are not, you know, respecting me in the same way that they would if I was like, you know, able-bodied like white man. So I think that those are the ways that like my identity like really affects me. And I think also representation is a big one too. Like when I was growing up, I did not see a disabled person, you know, in any type of media. I didn't see, or definitely not a disabled person of color, not someone who was queer as well, not someone who was like doing environmental work or farming. With my identity, that just was not something that I saw. And so, you know, I really struggled with like, what do I see myself doing? Because disabled folks are often seen as like, we can't do things, you know, we can't participate in like life or work or whatever it is, play to relationships, whatever it is. And so that was something that I very much had to sort of figure out on my own. And I think like today I see a little bit more of it with like social media and like ways to connect with folks online and just like more role models in general. But yeah, I think that like those are the ways that like my racial identity and my identity as a disabled person like really impact me on a day-to-day basis. And I think I really have to make sure that as a person with like a leadership position at the farm that I work at, it's been interesting to see how like now that I have a title as like a manager, there's been like so much more respect than I've like ever gotten in my life. And that I know it's because like I'm seen as like a woman, I'm seen as like a woman of color with a disability, you know, and until I had like a title that people saw fit as like a leader or whatever it is, that's when people started listening to me a little bit more and like respecting my opinion. And even still, of course, like I will not have the same respect as like a able-bodied like white man ever. So that is also why I like choose to work in spaces that I feel safe in, that like I see myself and that I am in community with. And like doing that will just always, like having done that will change my life, because I'm probably not ever going to try and insert myself in a space that is incredibly unsafe long term, I think, ever again. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that kind of hopefully gets people on this call who are listening to each of you speak and sign and share where you're coming from about, yeah, what are the ways in which our cultures are not safe? And not taking that as a slight, but that being a gift and an opportunity for us to explore ways that, again, we're leading to inclusive cultures. Like when we talk about diversity a lot, whether you're nonprofit, for profit, arts and culture, it doesn't matter. It's always, I think we're always centered on diversity. And that is not about folks who need more. That's not about equity. That's about bodies in a space, rather than us focusing on what is the culture we are creating in our organization. Is that a culture that is inclusive, or are we just focused on being able to put different people on our brochure that maybe don't actually exist in our organization? Or are we proactively creating spaces where the diversity comes when we're creating cultures of inclusion? And when diversity does come, they feel safer. We can't guarantee completely safe spaces unless we are creating them for ourselves sometimes, but we can create safer spaces for people that move about the world differently. Julian, how about for you?
Similar to Hannah's comments, actually, I would say in terms of respect, people seem to show that differently. How they treat me, I feel they treat me differently compared to somebody who's white. And yeah, let's say, for example, with the police officers, maybe because I'm Black, I might be seen as a suspect, or they might treat me suspiciously. Like if I'm outside walking to or from the store, And, a cop could very easily just, jump out of the car with their guns positioned on me, and I don't know. And that, if they're yelling freeze, well, I can't hear. And if they're behind me, maybe they're thinking I'm ignoring them and just, continuing to walk. And, they could shoot. That's a risk to my life. That's what I feel. And so that's a major problem for me, and I definitely don't like that. And then there's an example I've seen. It's a music video by Rod Wave. It's a really great song. And it's about Tombstone, and it shows a deaf child in the video. And I definitely encourage you, if you have time, if you can make time, watch the video. I would appreciate it. And the video is named Tombstone.
Tombstone. Thanks for sharing that, Julian. Yeah, I think that's a call in again to folks who do not move about the world as Black folks, as Indigenous folks, and even for myself as a person of color who moves about the world with a lot of light skin privilege. I don't have to think about certain things that Black folks do, and that is a privilege. And then exploring how in my privilege am I decentering myself in conversations, for example, like Julian brought up about policing, like as someone who's not most impacted in that environment, how am I using my privilege and voice to elevate the voices of other folks, to uplift Black leadership, to decenter myself in that conversation, and then to think about the intersections of identity. And what Julian is talking about is this expanded, compounded fear, I think, in moving about the world with those intersecting identities. And regardless of your ability or disability, however folks identify, the intersection that Black, Indigenous, and other people of color have to hold, there's added emotional labor in the ways in which those folks move about the world. So how are we re-examining, again, our cultures and ourselves as individuals too, not just your organization, but as an individual, how are you using the privileges, because we all have them, to elevate folks that are most impacted and advocate for spaces that are more inclusive, that are safer, that are representative of the identities that tend to get left out the most. Izzy, how about for you?
Yeah. I feel like kind of jumping on the kind of like light skin privilege is I'm Hispanic. I'm a lot lighter than a lot of people in the community, in my family. However, as a child, I was a lot darker. I used to spend every summer in the Southwest in New Mexico. I haven't in the past couple years because COVID and just other issues that arose pre-COVID. So I feel like I'm moving through the world a lot differently than I ever have in my entire life. And it kind of hurts to notice that. I was very insecure about the color of my skin when I was a kid. I feel like a lot of darker skinned children can relate to that. Just kind of wearing longer sleeves, wanting to hide that part of myself. And then especially after my diagnosis, it felt like so much all at once of now I joke about it a lot. Like I hold a lot of minority cards, making fun of my non-minority friends kind of stuff. But, when I want to say I got diagnosed at like 13-ish. It was a lot dealing with the insecurity from being Hispanic, not speaking Spanish, being a lot darker. I did go to a predominantly Hispanic school for middle school. However, I was in this program called the Summit Program, which is for highly capable students, gifted students, that gifted kid burnout. But it just, I don't know, there weren't a lot of people of color in that class. It was 40 to 50 kids, 40 after some people dropped out. I don't blame them. But within that class, there were 3 Hispanic kids, me being one of them, and 1 Black guy in my class. And it was insane. There was no exposure to my culture. I didn't understand a lot of the slang when I started making friends who were Hispanic. A lot of the slang that I knew is very outdated because I knew it from my parents, like in Spanish. So it was very hard to keep up. And then also with that, with being autistic and not understanding tone and stuff, and just a lot of social norms, kind of relearning that for a whole different set of people and cultural norms was very hard for me. And then also just being a person of color who is disabled, there's a lot of issues in like the medical community, you know, so I kind of get that ableism and medical racism. I noticed that when doctors come into the room, they're always addressing my mom first. They're very shocked that I can speak. Every single time I get this comment of like, oh, it says you're autistic on your chart. Do we need to like update that? And it's like, no, I'm able to verbally communicate. There was an ADHD clinic I was trying to get into a while back. I didn't end up going. It just wasn't the right fit for me. But they were telling me that I couldn't attend because I had that diagnosis of autism on there, and the doctors don't deal with autistic kids. It's very hard to find a therapist. I currently don't have one. I used to when I first got my diagnosis for about a year, but it's very hard to find someone who understands race and works with someone who is autistic, who is a teenager. It's just all of that is very hard. And being in school, I have a 504 plan, which is a legal document that I give to teachers and administrators with certain accommodations for me. And I have been advised multiple times to not list that I am autistic. Right now in my 504, I only have anxiety and ADHD on there because teachers won't want me in their classes if I list that I'm autistic. I take pretty much all honors NAP classes. I'm doing Running Start right now. And it was very kind of heartbreaking to understand that there are certain accommodations that I'm just not going to receive because that puts my academic position in danger, you know, and especially being brown, a lot of teachers just don't take me seriously. You know, even within that summit program, you know, part of it is you have to take this test and there's 3 categories and you have to score a certain score in one of the categories and that's how you got in. I scored pretty much the highest score on all 3 categories. I'm not very book smart, but like I am intelligent, and a lot of teachers treated me like I was kind of like the stupidest person in the class, you know, didn't explain things to me. And there were a lot of racially insensitive comments just because the main demographic for that program were not people that looked like me as a child. And plus having an undiagnosed disability as a kid and racism I was experiencing at school, it was all a lot at once. So yeah.
Yeah, thank you for sharing, each of you, like what that experience, you know, has been. I'm curious if you can speak to how institutions, organizations can create spaces that do feel safer and that do feel more accessible without you having to proactively ask for those things. Even though I'm asking you here, how can we share with people who are on this call, like, here are some proactive things that you can do to make this accessible to not just folks that maybe share the same disability as me, but for everyone. Who wants to take that one? Who wants to go first?
I can start. I think, I wish that organizations and institutions would just talk about these things. Like when I have worked in, like white-led environmental organizations, they just don't even talk about, folks with disability, racism. I mean, like maybe a little bit of DEI work on racism, but not much more than that. And then it's sort of seen as like a one and done conversation, and they don't have to deal with it again. When really there's that culture is still going to be there where it's not talked about continuously, and there's not an expectation set to make the environment inclusive and accessible and centering folks with like marginalized identities usually. And so I think the first step is really, centering the leadership of folks of color and folks with disability, like actually hiring people who have those identities and putting them in leadership positions, I think is a big move to make. And I think also the work itself shouldn't uphold the institution that is like racist and ableist and all of that. And so I think that's what I'm finding in my work these days, is that a lot of people will ask like, how can I like do better DEI or like whatever, but it's still within an institution or like organization that's upholding like racist values or ableist values. And so there's definitely like structural work that should be done. And a lot of it has to do with leadership, but also like, how are you helping the community, like the people that you're trying to work for in a way that is inclusive and like including folks with disability and non-white people too. And so just like creating that culture of talking about it and an expectation of creating an accessible space, and also having some sort of accountability when there's like racist remarks made, or when there's sort of a difficult situation or an ableist situation coming up. Like, how do you take the burden off of those folks who are disabled or who are holding those identities, and make it like an accountability thing for the whole organization, without like, prioritizing like the image of the organization and like how it might look to hold yourself accountable to those types of values. So I think it's a little complicated, but I think people are doing it and it's possible. So yeah.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Hannah. You touched on a couple of things that I think are really powerful. And this is like again, an invitation to the folks that are on this call to take back to your organizations. But there's a woman named Glenise L. Pike, and she has an anti-racism kind of collective and workbook. She does a lot of work in that arena. And one of the things that she shared is you cannot dismantle white supremacy and uphold it at the same time. And I think a lot of our organizations and even us as individuals are good at that. We're good at using the language because maybe we don't want to acknowledge the harm that we perpetuate. We're all going to harm each other. Like, we can't escape that. We're going to harm each other forever, but it's what we do when we've harmed somebody and how we take accountability. And there are principles within restorative justice that the whole body of work is centering the person that's been harmed. How has harm happened to you, and what would make you feel whole again? What makes you feel full? And inviting the person who's done that harm to be a part of that process too, if that's possible. And so what are the ways in which we can kind of shift the way that we do things at work to center folks who are harmed, rather than excuses being made like, well, that wasn't that person's intention, or you took it the wrong way, or they're really trying. What are the excuses that we make rather than, hey, I'm sorry that happened to you. That shouldn't have happened. Like, what would make you feel whole again? How can we cultivate trust between you and this person? Is that possible? We don't have those conversations at work, and it'll take time to unpack how we do that, especially in the world of HR, especially in the world of like institutions that benefit and are founded on this white supremacy culture. How do we begin to dismantle that and move forward rather than trying to dismantle it while we uphold it at the same time? Those are really powerful things that you shared, Hannah. Julian, what about for you? What is something that people can do to make their organization more accessible and inclusive?
Really, so what I'm thinking about or what comes to mind is again, going back to closed captionings and having those accommodations for people who need them, such as writing back and forth with whatever technology that can be allowed in that realm, and able to help us navigate that system or that institution, because Black deaf people, we have these layers, and like it has been mentioned, they're hard and tough to navigate. And so to be able to excel and move up in leadership, I think that they just should have these tools and accommodations in place, and that would like change the environment and the culture of the system, business, or organization.
Yeah, thanks for that, Julian. Representation matters. I know each of you have kind of spoken to that. And again, when we're focused on culture, the diversity becomes a part of that. Because if we're creating an inclusive culture for people, folks that maybe have been on the outskirts, I like to use the word underinvited. It takes the onus, like we have to take responsibility for that. Because I'm sure within the deaf community or Black community or Latinx community, those folks are not marginalized in those communities. It is our job, or we have to take responsibility for the ways in which we've underinvited communities into our organizations. That's the responsibility that we have to shift those systems. Izzy, how about for you?
Yeah, I think something that people can do is not treating accessibility like it's like a chore, like it's just another thing that you have to do. It should just be you wanting more people to enjoy what you're making and producing, or be able to enjoy the communities that you're creating, and not assuming that everyone's your idea of normal, not assuming that everyone's going to be, white and neurotypical and able-bodied, and understanding that difference doesn't mean bad. I feel like there's a lot of places that have been advertised as accessible, especially within the classrooms, teachers coming up to me and being like, I know you have a 504 plan. I'm going to do the best to make my classroom like a safe space, whatever. And then when I start using my accommodations, then it's a very different story, or people who have been around me who are like, oh yeah, that's totally fine. Yeah, you're autistic or whatever. I'll do my best to accommodate you. And then getting annoyed when I have like little alarms going off all the time. That's a part of my ADHD. There's a lot of time blindness. I don't really process the passing of time. So I have little alarms to let me know that it's like, oh, it's been like an hour. Let's do things. So just people acknowledging that there's a lot of different ways to go through the world, and that's okay.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think the one thing I wanted to bring up too for each of you, and Hannah and Izzy and Julian are all being paid for their time to be here today. And one of the things that I want to challenge organizations here, or individuals that are going back to their organizations, is pay people for their emotional labor, pay people for their expertise, especially if they are BIPOC folks that are sharing wisdom that you might not have in your organization. And even if you do have people within your organization that bring perspectives that you don't, you should pay those people for their time also. I think a lot of times we get into institutions and it's always the Black, Indigenous person of color who are like, hey, we need to do some racial equity work. What do you think we should do? But I'm not going to pay you for it. I'm just going to put that in your arena based on your identity and expect you to do that work. What are the ways in which our institutions have expectations of people and we're not paying people for their emotional labor, for the extra amount of work that they're having to do to show up in a space and not even as their full self? Do we feel that our organizations allow people to show up as their full selves at work? I think that's a really important question that we have to ask ourselves, right? It's like, are we creating an environment where people feel like they don't have to leave part of themselves at the door, but can show up fully exactly who they are and to be embraced and supported? I think another thing I wanted to mention too is that there's a difference between centering people's voice and tokenizing them. And I think sometimes it tends to be this really kind of fine line that people get confused on, of like, well, I want to hear where you're coming from, so I'm going to ask you. But again, how are we, when we talk about centering someone's voice, it's like, I want to hear what you need, and then we're going to make the changes that you ask for. I feel it's tokenizing to say, share my experience, thank you for sharing, and nothing's going to change. Even if that's not the intention behind engaging with somebody, when we ask people for what they need, what are we willing to give up? How are we willing to use our power or our position or our privilege to advocate for changes that need to be made to make sure that everyone within our organization, especially those who have historically and presently been underinvited into our institutions, feel that they are safe, that they are centered, they are represented? Because I remember who said it, maybe it was Hannah, but when we take care of everybody, when we center people who are disabled or who are BIPOC folks, other people benefit from that. People who have different class structures or citizenship status or gender, when we are creating spaces that are reaching those folks that have been underinvited into our culture, our institutions, we're creating spaces that benefit everybody. And so really trying to really think about the difference between tokenizing and centering, and making sure that if we're ready to make some changes, acknowledging that we're going to have to let some things go. They're going to have to decenter ourselves in the conversation, that we might have to invest some money. Maybe that means that your giving campaign in the fall, you have to raise more dollars to make sure every event we have an ASL interpreter. We always have captioning. Maybe that means that some people, all of your events need to be hybrid now. Maybe just work needs to be hybrid. Some folks are going to be more productive and safer working from home. Other folks might really need community and to be able to come into the office. For folks that are deaf, I can imagine looking at a screen is exhausting. Being in with people, reading lips, watching signs, trying to pick up on social cues, Izzy, trying to keep track of time, all of these expectations that we have is just extra work that you have to do, right? We're going to take one question. If somebody else has a question in the audience, please drop it in there. And then I want to leave a little bit early so that you can rest your eyes and recharge. But one of the questions in the chat is, what does it mean for me to be an ally? Like, what does that look like for you? It is important to know what you see and feel and think so I can create the space and be in service to that. No lip service, but action. So for each of you, what does an ally look like? What does that mean for you? And Julian, maybe I'll pass it to you first.
Well, for me, ally would mean partnering, providing support, using privilege, and in fact, using that type of privilege to help me and letting me see that happen, making me aware of it. That's what I would say.
Yeah, risking something and showing like, hey, Julian, I got your back. I'm going to advocate in this way and create space. If there's not space, I'm going to create it. And we do that together. Izzy, what about for you?
An ally for me is like someone who says they're going to be there and they mean it, you know, and it's not just, oh, I'm going to listen to whatever you say, but also doing research, getting involved with the community. You know, I'm obviously not the sole voice of autism and autistic people or people with like ADHD and stuff like that. Everyone has different needs, and I care a lot about my community. You know, I'm organizing panels like this to make sure that everyone is aware and knowledgeable, to provide accessibility for people with disabilities similar to my own, different to my own, with more needs than me, with less needs than me, all of that. So somebody that's like actually going to put in the research and the time and isn't just saying whatever, is what an ally would look like to me.
Yeah. How about for you, Hannah?
Yeah, I think Julian and Izzy made some really great points. I think that like someone who is willing to take on the burden of like making a space more accessible and inclusive, no matter like when and where, so that we don't have to put ourselves in that vulnerable position of asking for it, whether it's just for ourselves or for a few people in the room. Just knowing full well that like if you are able to take on that burden, you're probably going to help like many people in the room. And I think you know, one thing that's sort of tied to the question that we were talking about before too is that we're asked to like produce and produce and produce at this like rate that is really hard to keep up with, whether you are able-bodied or not able-bodied. And helping create a culture where we don't have to like grind and produce and work really hard constantly is also part of like undoing ableism and undoing sort of like the racism and the colonization that we are all like suffering under essentially. And so you know, and like one thing I did too was like I started reading books by like BIPOC, disabled, and like queer folks, and maybe that's like a really great place to start. My favorite book is Care Work, and that work, you know, just talks about like the activism and advocacy of like queer disabled folks of color, and just like from there I've been able to find my own language, and I wish that everyone had that language for talking about disability justice and like how they can advocate for that work, and like how we can also care for one another in a way that is not just like, we're like making it accessible. It's like, no, we're like caring for our community and like everyone who's in the space, and making sure that they can participate as themselves. So yeah, that's what I would say being an ally is. And then also like Alina mentioned, just like pay people, you know, even if they're not even doing anything, just Venmo some folks who are a person of color, just Venmo them. They would appreciate it.
Yeah, you should drop your Venmos in the chat. Thank you for sharing that, Hannah. I'm like, how are we redirecting resources to people and honoring their emotional labor, paying for them for their time and their expertise? And I think especially young people, like for the older folks on this call, like how are we centering young people and elevating their voices and again, like uplifting those voices and paying people for their time and their work and their energy. Like, how are the ways in which we are, again, decentering our voice? Like, we can't always be the ones at the decision-making table thinking that we have everything figured out, because we don't. So what are the ways in which we are elevating and encouraging those voices to speak? Before we go, I just wanted, if folks that are still in attendance, if you can just put some words of gratitude in the chat, use your reaction buttons in Zoom, and just send some love and just gratitude to each of the panelists, to Julian and to Hannah and to Izzy. If you could flood the chat with that stuff, that would be great. Again, you can use your reactions too, but just wanted to hold space. And then also just a lot of gratitude to Eva, who's our captioner, to both of the Antonios who we had double Antonios today with ASL interpreters. And it was wonderful to have that and to be able to create an accessible lunch and learn. This is being recorded, so we'll get the captions put up on there. This will live on the Seattle Arts and Culture for Anti-Racism website. And I'm going to drop my email in the chat as well, in case you are not, in case you or your organization wants to be added to our email list, or you want to connect about different things that are going on. And I'm also going to drop the website into the chat as well. And once we get that up, we'll make sure that all of our videos, we have a couple of videos on there that still need to be captioned so they're accessible. But we did a whole series of lunch and learns on policing, and I want to make sure that those are all accessible to the community too. So just a lot of gratitude and appreciation. I don't know if you can see the stuff coming into the chat for the panelists, but a lot of folks are super grateful for your time and your energy and for sharing. So I lift up my hands to both of you, like, thank you so much, all three of you, for being here today. And we will go ahead and wrap a little bit early. Is there anything else, Hannah or Izzy or Julian, that you want to share before we end? Okay. Were you going to say something, Hannah? Okay. Okay, everyone. Have a wonderful day. Again, thank you for spending this time together, and we'll see you soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, y'all.